Well, good morning again. I'm Despina Aphrodite Milaki. I am the UN representative for the International Representation Association and the chair of the Civil Society Forum. In this capacity, I would like to welcome you all to the 2024 Civil Society Forum. We extend a heartfelt welcome to all of you who are here today and to those of you who are watching us online. I'm deeply grateful to all our distinguished speakers who join us here, and not only in this opening panel, but also in the panels that will follow throughout the entire day. We are very honored to have you here all, and I wish to thank our colleagues at UNDESA and the Bureau of the 62nd session of the UN Commission for Social Development for opening this space for the civil society and for the people who work with us. We are grateful for this opportunity to highlight the intrinsic and important connection between social development and social justice as fundamentals to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. A multi-sectoral engagement by all, for all, with all is necessary. One that commits to systemic change with human rights as its foundation. The focus must be on placing people and justice at the center of social development. As members of civil society, we know firsthand from the grassroots level how fostering social inclusion, social development, eradicating poverty, and promoting human dignity are all necessary to advance the 2030 agenda in this midpoint and also to advance the principles of the Copenhagen Declaration. Because today our world is failing to achieve social justice and deliver on the pledge at the heart of the 2030 agenda. Today, billions of people are left behind, trapped in a cycle of poverty, uncertainty, and vulnerability. Today, our society, our future, is threatened by structural inequalities and multiple layers of injustice. We, the NGO Committee on Social Development, continue to envision a world without poverty, of true prosperity, with inclusion and justice for all. We bring a diversity of voices to the United Nations, and we hope that at the end of this day, you will have heard the voices of the people whose knowledge and engagement are crucial building blocks to foster fair societies. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our distinguished speakers. In the interest of time, I will not offer full introductions to each one of our esteemed guests on this panel. Their bios are in the program that you received, and also you can find them online on our website. Let us begin with remarks from Jean Quinn, our chair, the chair of the NGO Committee on Social Development and executive director of Unanima International. Jim, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. Is this working? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to welcome particularly Her Excellency Ruchira Kamboj, Ambassador and Chair of CSocD Bureau. We know this is an extraordinarily busy week and we're really appreciative of you coming to be with us today. Mr. Li Junhua, United Nations Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. Dr. Philippe Pallier, United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Youth Affairs. Mr. John Wilmoth, Officer in charge of the Division for Inclusive Social Development. Mr. Danilo Turk, we've met many times during this week, President of Club de Madrid and former President of Slovenia. And Dr. Michael Broning, we've met as well during the week, Executive Director, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, New York office. You're all very, very welcome. And as Despina said, my name is Jean Quinn and I'm the chair of NGO CSocD. And as I look around and see all my colleagues, I represent them on behalf of the executive. Welcome to the 2024 Civil Society Forum. It's such a joy to have all of you with us during this year's Civil Society Forum. Since 2006, this forum has been a space for members of civil society to gather, to learn, discuss, and strategize on the themes and deliberations on the Commission for Social Development. We're optimistic about our current and future possibilities, particularly for collaboration with the United Nations and member states. Our experience with member states in the past few weeks has given us reason to be optimistic in our way forward as we gather and continue our conversation with dignity and respect. We, the NGO Committee for Social Development, are guided by the principles of the Copenhagen Declaration and its programme for action, along with the 2030 Agenda. We want to address multidimensional poverty, which encompasses the various deprivations experienced by people made and kept poor in their daily lives. And that requires an approach that acknowledges and responds to the complex interactions between different forms of disadvantage and discrimination. The report of the Secretary-General for this Commission, CSocD62, is most informative and clearly outlines the background and challenges that face humanity when it comes to human rights, social justice, social development, and especially those people who are marginalised. And at the forefront of those global issues are the youth, our youth. However, progress towards education for all has slowed down since 2015. As a result of the pandemic in 2019, only 1 in 6 countries is expected to achieve universal secondary school completion by 2030. With an estimated 84 million children and young people out of school and 300 million students lacking basic numeracy and literacy skills. Grassroots organisations and experts have documented the devastating consequences of COVID-19, reporting widespread job losses and increased school dropout rates for youth who lack the digital skills and access to technology needed to succeed in a world that moved online. These consequences have proven to be long-lasting as a cycle of exclusion and discrimination for youth experiencing poverty. Inequality in access to fundamental social services such as education, healthcare and social protections exacerbates power asymmetries, weakens social cohesion and undermines stability. Yet, in this defining moment in history where challenges loom large in their complexity, we are a people of hope. And we know there are hopeful signs that the United Nations will lead us forward in a better world for all. This hope is supported by the UN Secretary-General's Our Common Agenda, calling for a renewal of the social contract. So many things we've talked about this week. As a global community, we have proven our ability to build resilience and find innovative solutions. And we must now empower future generations to lead initiatives for peace, sustainability, equality, justice, and human rights. All over the world, youth already act as critical agents of change within their communities and have demonstrated an ability to think beyond limits, to innovate with incomparable creativity, and to dream of a world that transcends current limitations. We have to nurture that creativity, provide space for the youth, for their ideas to flourish, and remove the multiple barriers to education, employment, and institutional representation that continue to inhibit the full realising of youth's rights and capabilities. Inclusive participation in decision-making for all is mandatory as we seek to renew our social contract and honour the commitments of the human rights and Copenhagen declarations and achieve the goals outlined in the 2030 Agenda. And I'll end, as I always do, remembering the people we represent, who say to us, "Don't talk about us without us." All people experiencing extreme poverty need to be included in the development of a renewed social contract. Only by leaving no one behind can we collectively strive for a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, for your remarks. And as you very well pointed out, the importance of collaboration between the civil society, the UN, and multiple stakeholders. I think the Civil Society Forum is exactly a space where all stakeholders are gathered here to discuss how to accelerate action to achieve a fairer and more inclusive society. Thank you again for your leadership, and thank you for your remarks. Now it is my honor to invite Ambassador Ruchira Kamboj, the chair of the 62nd session of the Commission for Social Development, to take the floor. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I'm indeed delighted to be here with all of you today, and I would like to express my gratitude for this invitation. It is an honor to have the opportunity to speak at the Civil Society Forum. Now, as we all know, and as we will all agree, the world is changing rapidly, which brings both opportunities and challenges. In order to take advantage of these changes and avoid being negatively affected by them, governments should invest more in people. This will help promote social progress, trust, and solidarity. If governments, however, continue with their usual approach, it will increase the gaps that already exist and leave more people behind. By 2030, we aim to witness substantial advancements in accomplishing the Sustainable Development Goals. We imagine a world where we can sustain this progress in the future by advocating for social justice and empowerment and digital transformation for everyone. Now, everyone, regardless of their social or economic background, should have equal access to opportunities, resources, and rights. Social justice requires equitable access to healthcare, education, food, water, housing, employment, social protection, and digital technologies that leave no one behind. It aims to address the underlying cause of poverty and inequality in a world where it is estimated that more than 600 million people still live in extreme poverty. So social justice is crucial for achieving the SDGs. Fostering social justice requires transformative change. It is a commitment to guaranteeing that every person is given equal opportunities and dignity. True achievement of social justice can only occur when we actively amplify and listen to the voices of people in vulnerable situations. Now, turning to digital transformation, this has been shown to have great potential for improving people's lives and protecting the planet. We are currently experiencing an era of digital revolution like never before. The first step, however, towards a future where everyone has access to digital technology is to ensure universal access and bridge digital divides. This will help promote equal opportunities within societies and among different societies. So what do we do? Well, to build a sustainable future for everyone, we need to change our mindset and focus on promoting stronger social policies, because when one person is left behind, everyone is left behind. This will help us address the root causes of poverty, inequality, and digital exclusion. Now, everyone, I will stress here, everyone, regardless of their social or economic background, should have equal access to opportunities, resources, and rights. Social justice requires, as I've already stressed, equitable access to healthcare, education, food, water, housing, employment, social protection, and digital technologies that leave no one behind. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I close, as I taper off, we must absolutely, I will say, enhance international cooperation in order to assist people in vulnerable situations by guaranteeing their access to essential services such as social protection, healthcare, education, and digital technology. And by working together to create a more just and equitable world, we can ensure that everyone has the opportunity to live a life of dignity and well-being in our collective quest to truly leave no one behind. Back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Thank you for your remarks. In addition to your important awards, I would simply emphasize what you said about social justice, that we need, it requires transformative change. And what we need is to change our mindset, because if one is left behind, then everyone is left behind. Thank you again for your remarks and your leadership and hard work this week and the weeks before. Those weeks have demonstrated your commitment to the ideals of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Copenhagen Declaration. So I thank you. I'm now privileged to introduce Mr. Lee Junhua, the UN Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. Thank you, Your Excellency, for accepting our invitation. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, for giving me the floor. Well, good morning, dear friends. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this Civil Society Forum of the Commission for Social Development. It is always a great pleasure for UNDESA to engage with representatives of civil society who are committed to increasing public awareness and contributing to the discussions on emerging social and social development issues. My thanks also goes to the NGO Committee on the Social Development and the Frederick Albert Foundation for their excellent collaboration in organizing this important event. This forum convenes at a time when the SDG, which carries the hopes, dreams, and expectations of the people everywhere, are at the risk of being left behind, as articulated and highlighted by the Secretary General in his report. It is very true, we have the bleaking picture. Only 15% of the goals are on the track. But as previous speakers underlined, that not is lost. Not all is lost. We still have hope. A hope does exist. At the SDG summit in September last year, world leaders issued a call for action to promote a more inclusive, just, peaceful, resilient, and sustainable world for people and the planet, for the current and the future generations. Rescuing the SDGs will require the global concerted efforts of governments, the private sector, and civil society. It will require a shift in how we think about the social, economic, and environmental policies that allows us to center our decision-making on the well-being of the people and planet. By implementing transformative social policies, we can address the barriers that impede progress and ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, has the opportunity to succeed. When these policies are created with a strong commitment to justice, they can bring about significant change. Social justice ensures that every person is treated fairly and equitably. In order to achieve the social justice, we need to prioritize inclusivity and diversity. This involves creating environments where everyone, every voice is heard and valued, and where the discrimination and prejudice are not tolerated. Social policies that prioritize quality education, universal health care, decent work, social protection, and empowerment are crucial for lifting people out of poverty and addressing the root causes of the inequality. Investing in social justice and working towards the eradication of the poverty is an investment in our shared community. Investing in digital transformation and bridging the digital divide is also crucial for promoting inclusive growth. It is important to make the investment that ensure the equal access to digital technologies for everyone, and support the skills training and continuous learning. Digital transformation policies should also prioritize the social development considerations, including disadvantaged individuals and communities. When member states now have endorsed the proposal by Secretary General to convene the World Social Summit in 2025, and to my best knowledge, the General Assembly is scheduled to adopt the resolution before the end of this month. This World Social Summit would build on the outcome of the SDG Summit and the forthcoming Summit of the Future to forge a new global consensus and concrete commitments to promote inclusive, equitable, and resilient societies. I myself and UNDESA are committed to advocating for inclusive, safe, and meaningful civil society participation in this milestone UN intergovernmental processes. We need to hear the voices to maximize the expertise and the ingenuity of the civil society in helping to get the world back on track to achieving the 2030 agenda. We count on you to work closely with the UN families and the member states towards accelerating progress in promoting social justice and the digital transformation for all. I sincerely wish you all a successful forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you for sharing your points. They were very inspiring and encouraging, especially what you mentioned about the resolution that is going to be adopted at the end of this month for the World Social Summit. It means a lot to us, and it gives us hope. And as you very well pointed out, and we are welcome your statement about the UN, that you count on us for the voices to be heard and loud and clear, the voices from people in need. Thank you again for everything, and I really appreciate your valuable contribution to this discussion today. So now our next speaker was recently appointed as the new UN Assistant Secretary General for Youth Affairs, Dr. Felipe Polier. I think being the youngest ever senior appointment in the history of the UN, if I'm not mistaken, it is my distinct honor to have you here, Dr. Polier, and thank you for accepting our invitation to join this panel. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. And allow me to start by thanking the NGO Committee for Social Development for inviting me and inviting our office to address you here today. Focusing this year's Commission on Social Development on the priority theme is timely and critically important. Social development and social justice are the underpinning factors affecting the lives and livelihoods of all people, from our health and well-being to our security, our economy, education, and employment. Comprehensive and well-resourced social policies can serve as instruments of change, empowering individuals and communities to break the vicious cycles of poverty and injustice. If adequately implemented, social policies can address systemic barriers, will allow for fair distribution of resources equitable, and will create opportunities for all. But we live in a very complex world, witnessing multidimensional crises such as climate change, conflict and humanitarian crisis, shrinking civic spaces, and taking place in parallel with the advancement of new technologies that are increasingly affecting all of the aspects of societal development. Globally, there are over 1.9 billion young people, the largest ever generation of youth in history, 90% of whom live in developing countries. At the heart of the 2030 agenda lies a commitment to leaving no one behind, to creating a world where all individuals can thrive regardless of their circumstances. To make this a reality for the 1.9 billion lives, we need innovative approaches to social development that are not only right-based, but also resilient and can cope with time. Involving young people and civil society in shaping the development of such policies, concerns, and recommendations are included will ensure that these policies are relevant and responsive to the needs of current and future generations. Allow me to highlight few areas of importance. Firstly, it is crucial to ensure young people access to health, quality education, and social protection systems. As recalled in the Transforming Education Summit, we need to transform education and invest in skills that prepare youth for the future. In particular, young women and girls, young persons with disabilities, indigenous youth, young refugees and migrants, and other groups of young people that are most often left behind. Secondly, while considering approaches on how to go about this, we must leverage innovation and digital technology to promote social justice. Digital transformation can be made inclusive and aligned with our collective goal if it's equal and just. And not only if the digital divide is addressed so that everyone can meaningfully benefit from the opportunity of digital transformation instead of fearing its risks. Although young people are often seen as digital natives, the reality is that not every young person has access to meaningful connection and is empowered to use technology. In fact, in low-income countries, only 45% of young people use the internet. Only by addressing this digital divide, we can enable young people's access to digital opportunities, to harness their digital skills, and to find innovative solutions to ensure young people's participation and engagement in shaping social development policies and programs. Lastly, I want to also highlight that addressing social and economic aspects to achieve social justice is not enough. We need to also consider environmental policies and aspects that significantly affect young people's life, impact in peace and security, and push so many out of their homes and their communities into poverty and insecurity. To address all of this, it is important that we work together in partnership with young people, as one of the largest generations, but also as a generation that is most likely to feel the impact of these policies and programs in the future. Aligned with strengthening collaboration and solidarity with young people, the UN Secretary General's policy brief on meaningful youth engagement puts forth overarching recommendations to member states. These recommendations encompass: 1, expanding and strengthening youth participation in decision-making at all levels, and 2, making youth engagement a requirement in all UN decision-making processes. By putting these recommendations into practice, we can ensure development that is responsive and grounded in the needs and aspirations of young people, while ensuring multi-stakeholders collaboration across sectors towards an inclusive and just social development. Just before I end my intervention, I would like to point out something. I'm not here as a young voice. I'm here as the head of an office that has a clear mandate, which is bringing more young voices into the UN processes and into this kind of discussions. Young people are too diverse to be represented by one voice. But our office will make all the efforts in how to bring this diversity into the conversations, and that the reflections I put into the table as the head of this office mostly represent these diverse voices we have around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Polier. Your appointment and the establishment of a specialized office for youth affairs within the UN undoubtedly marks a significant shift in the UN's commitment to youth. Your mandate in ensuring young people are meaningfully included in decision-making processes and spaces at all levels is in alignment with our advocacy priorities. So we are here to work with you and collaborate together towards this goal. Thank you again for being here today. I would like now to move into inviting our next speaker of the day, Mr. John Wilmoth, the Acting Director and Officer in charge of the Division for Inclusive Social Development, to take the floor. Mr. Wilmoth, thank you for being here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my gratitude to the NGO Committee for Social Development and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for inviting me to participate in today's Civil Society Forum. during the 62nd session of the Commission for Social Development. DESA supports this forum every year to enhance our valued and truly important collaboration and partnership with civil society. I am honored to be here today to speak about how social development and social justice are integral to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. The world stands today at a pivotal moment in history, facing multiple challenges and crises that range from climate change and violent conflicts to extreme and persistent inequality and a crippling burden of debt among some of the world's poorest countries. Ladies and gentlemen, we are far from fulfilling the pledge of the 2030 Agenda that no one will be left behind, when over 1 billion people are deprived of basic needs like food, water, healthcare, and education, and billions more lack sanitation and access to energy, jobs, housing, and social protection. At current rates of change, there will still be nearly 500 million people living in extreme poverty in 2030. We cannot, however, give up the fight. We must overcome the challenges and fight our way out of the crises. We must not despair, and we must seek opportunity amidst adversity. This critical juncture could be an occasion to come together as a global community to rebuild trust and revive, I'm sorry, I lost my place. I did this. I'm sorry. Is an occasion to come together as a global community to rebuild trust and revive the spirit of social justice, social inclusion, and solidarity that are the essence of social development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a blueprint for a better future for all. It is a call to action to end poverty and hunger, to protect the planet, and to ensure that all people everywhere can enjoy peace and prosperity. Sadly, the world is off track in meeting many of the goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda. Therefore, we need to correct the course we are on, now more than ever, if we want to achieve a world that values human dignity and provides protection for the most vulnerable among us. As highlighted earlier by Under-Secretary General Lee, a World Social Summit in 2025 would serve as a milestone in our journey towards 2030 and beyond. Together with the Summit of the Future later this year, the second World Summit for Social Development, proposed for next year, would mark a turning point in progress towards the SDGs by focusing attention on the social dimension of people-centered sustainable development. Friends and colleagues, the responsibility to seek transformative change lies with all of us. The UN looks to civil society and grassroots organizations as crucial partners in this work. Together, we must find innovative solutions to the pressing challenges and crises of today. As we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, technology can be a powerful enabler of social development. However, we must urgently find ways of effectively bridging the digital divides that exist between and within countries today, as mentioned by other speakers. We need civil society to continue to hold national governments accountable and to push for inclusive policies and programs that create opportunity and foster social justice, especially among the most disadvantaged and marginalized groups. The UN also counts on civil society to remind the international community of the critical need to redouble our efforts and to accelerate the pace of progress as we head towards the target year of 2030 for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now or never. The time to deliver on the ambition of the 2030 Agenda is now, and we can wait no longer. We must act quickly and work together to achieve the SDGs and to create a brighter future for all of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilmoth, for sharing these insights. I will only re-emphasize on the importance of rebuilding trust, and that's because we don't have more time to comment on any of the other important words that you shared with us. So the importance of rebuilding trust and reviving the spirit of social justice and social solidarity. Thank you for reaffirming the ongoing need to strengthen collaboration and partnerships between governments, the UN, civil society, and all stakeholders in order to create a more inclusive environment. Thank you. We are most grateful for your words. Now we will move to a very special speaker. We are especially pleased to welcome Mr. Danilo Turk, the president of Club de Madrid and former president of Slovenia. Mr. President, thank you for being here with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and we in Club de Madrid are very honored to be part of this discussion of the 2024 Civil Society Forum. I have been with various discussions this week, and I see a growing commitment and energy for social development as a major priority for the United Nations in the coming years. This is an important development, and we are very proud to be part of this development. Now, today we are meeting in the form of Civil Society Forum, and we have been asked several questions. One of them is, how have priorities for social development changed over time? An answer to this question would certainly have to include a realization that priorities have changed, but in fact they have not changed all that much. Eradication of poverty was defined as a major priority in Copenhagen in 1995, and priority of eradication of poverty remains. It has been central to the Millennium Development Goals and subsequently to Sustainable Development Goals, and it would be simply misleading to believe that something has changed so fundamentally that an entire reshaping of priorities has to take place. What is really needed is a better understanding of the profiles of poverty and better understanding for policies which are needed to eradicate poverty during our lifetime. We have heard other panelists speaking eloquently about tasks ahead, and I have not much to add to this, except to say that obviously opportunities that exist today must be seized. Technology, for example, has been there in 1995. 1995, during the Copenhagen Summit for Social Development, was not technologically deficient era. It was the time of development of technology. But now we are entering a new phase, and of course it would be very important to take advantage, first of all, of the technological opportunities, but also, and very importantly, of the scientific progress that has happened in the last 30 years, and which has enabled the international community to understand the profiles of poverty much better than before, and therefore design policies to address this problem much better than was done before. Secondly, again, the question of gender equality has been central in the entire policy making for social progress. Without gender equality, there is no social progress. It's very simple. In that sense, the priority has not changed. What has changed is the understanding how important the mobilization and the voices of women are, and how important it is to have those voices heard in any process focusing on social development and, of course, on other important priorities of the international community. So we see that changes happened, but changes did not in any way change the fundamental list of priorities, which is very well known and which has to be addressed very effectively. The question, therefore, is how? And this question, obviously, is something that has been discussed this week in great detail and will continue to be discussed, and some of interesting thoughts we have heard in this panel as well. I would just like to choose one when Dr. Philippe Paulier spoke about the fact, or about the need, really, that approach to social progress is not only rights-based, but it is also resilient. Now, there is a lot of rhetoric about rights-based approaches to this or the other priority. And obviously, I believe everybody agrees that the rights are fundamental. But the real question is not so much the acceptance or a general acceptance of a rights-based approach, but how to make such an approach real and resilient. And this is not an easy subject, because very often by trying to do that, there is a need to criticize the realities which are defining our world today. And of course, this is a special challenge for the civil society organizations. Let me just mention one example. I believe that we all understand that the world is now entering a very dangerous phase, which is characterized by phenomena such as military spending. Now, the question is, should the activists of social progress, social development, criticize these changes in policy making which give much higher priority to military spending than was the case until recently? Is this something that belongs to the discussion on social development for the future? I'm not suggesting an answer. I'm just aware that we are meeting in the form of civil society community, and civil society has to retain its unique and precious capacity to criticize, to express critique, to organize around critical thought. I mentioned military spending because it is so important today. And of course, there are many other aspects of realities of our time which require very critical consideration and criticism. And finally, one of the questions which was put before us was, how do we make the UN space more accessible to civil society? Here I have two short points to make. First, UN has opened to civil society quite extensively. I have been working with the UN, and I have started as an NGO representative some half a century ago, and I can say today the participation of civil society organizations in UN processes is completely different from what it was decades ago. So there has been progress, and we have to take advantage of that progress. New technologies, internet-based communication allow us to expand communication much more, and civil society should take advantage of that completely. But my second and last point during my short remarks is this. It is really critical that the preparations for the second World Summit on Social Development are brought closer to the people. Now, I'm saying this for a very particular reason. We just heard Under Secretary General Lee, who told us that the resolution that would start the process of preparations will be adopted by the General Assembly before the end of this month. So this means that very soon there will be a need to figure out how does one actually organize preparations for a major meeting of heads of state and government to take place only in about a year and a half from now. This is not much time. And given the nature of the subject of that gathering, social development, it would be very important that the preparations are brought to the people, that they are not left to the diplomatic negotiating process in UN conference rooms. There will be, of course, a lot of need for subtle diplomacy. There will be serious need for member states to consider what the diplomatic process should produce. But diplomatic process is not the whole preparation. I think the World Social Summit will succeed only if it is conceived and if it happens as an expression of the will of the people globally. Now, this is difficult to do, and 1 year and a half is not much time to do it, but it has to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We really appreciate your presence here this morning and your works, your remarks. It's wonderful. I'll only need to re-emphasize what you said about the rights-based approach that we all talk about. It needs to be resilient and needs to be real. And as for us, the civil society, we need to retain our capacity to criticize and to ask solutions and to require spaces in order for us to be able to amplify the voices of the vulnerable people that we represent. Thank you again for your intervention. At this point, I would like to introduce a critical collaborator of this forum, Dr. Michael Berning, the Executive Director of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in New York office, as a source of funding and support for the civil society at the UN, as well as for the advancement of SDGs. Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed delegates. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to support this year's Civil Society Forum, framework of the Commission on Social Development. I'd like to congratulate the organizers and, of course, my esteemed speakers who did an excellent job this morning. Thank you so much. As we address the critical topic of social development, it's imperative that we do not get lost in abstractions. At the heart of social development lies the fundamental principle of equality, and at the heart of the principle of equality lies the belief in the inherent dignity of every individual, irrespective of background, identity, or status. Now, this is not moralism, this is common sense, and it transcends language and cultural barriers. The truth is, we cannot advance as a global community if we believe behind those who are marginalized. And we cannot advance if progress is something that happens only to those who already have it all. At a time where cycles of injustice reinforce one another, we must ensure that our policies, programs, and initiatives prioritize the needs and aspirations of the most vulnerable. Every person deserves to live a life free from discrimination, oppression, and violence, and we must strive to create societies where everybody has equal access to opportunities and justice under the rule of law. Moreover, sustainable social development cannot happen without the empowerment of communities, and communities need individuals who do not only have the right to participate, who actually have the means to participate. In the words of the great British philosopher Isaiah Berlin, we don't only need negative freedom as freedom from oppression, we also need positive freedom, a positive concept of liberty. We need abstract rights, and we need the actual capacity to make use of our liberties. And that's one of the great truths of the political left, of course. Without a balance between positive and negative freedom, there's no justice, there's no fairness, there's no equality, and there's no progress, social or otherwise. Only by fostering a culture of participation can we therefore strengthen social cohesion, build trust between citizens and institutions, and foster sustainable development. And this is, of course, especially important at a time where people around the world are upset and they are taking to the streets to protest. In many parts of the world, we are experiencing what could be described as an epidemic of a lack of trust. There's an erosion of trust. And often we, as political observers, we feel that people are moving away from politics. But maybe the opposite is closer to the truth. Maybe in many cases, politics is moving away from people, and public grievances are only too legitimate. From city squares to digital spaces, people around the world are taking to the streets and they demand justice, equality, and change in the spirit of democracy. Last but not least, in my own home country of Germany, where we have seen in the last couple of weeks an unprecedented wave of demonstrations. And this wave of demonstrations is not something that we should fear, it's something that we should celebrate, because it is testament to the collective yearning for a world that truly embodies the principles of democracy and social development. Now, addressing these concerns requires renewed commitment to inclusive governance, transparency, and accountability. We need to make sure that political institutions are responsive, from a town hall or a city hall right up to the Security Council of the United Nations. Governments need to listen to the needs and aspirations of the communities they serve. And here, the importance of finance cannot be overstated. To put it simply, money matters. Without investment and adequate funds, there is no social development. That's why we need a strong role of the UN in international taxation and a constructive approach towards debt management for countries that are highly indebted. Ensuring adequate financing is essential to fund social programs and infrastructure, because only by mobilizing resources effectively can we actually create the conditions for inclusive and sustainable development. And again, social development is not something that is nice to have, a luxury. It's essential. It fosters social cohesion, it strengthens communities, and it builds resilience against society challenges of all kinds. Therefore, investing in social development is not only an ethical imperative, it's smart strategically. And this is especially important in the face of escalating global tensions, and I would congratulate my previous speaker, Danilo Türk, on his remark. Our reflections here today and in this week on social development cannot ignore the world out there. We must recognize the inherent danger of military confrontation. Of course, social scientists have agreed for decades that peace and development reinforce one another and that they are interrelated. But the opposite is true as well. The opposite is true for war. War is not the father of everything. It is the great destructor of progress. War disrupts communities, it aggravates inequalities, and war undermines the very fabric of social cohesion. Therefore, as advocates for social justice, we need a redoubling of efforts to prevent conflicts and to promote peaceful resolutions to disputes. And what we must never do is delegitimize diplomacy as naive. Certainly, contrary to war, peace is not just something that one side can declare, but it's absolutely frightening how our global conversation has gotten used to chilling speculation about another round of global destruction, as if this was just something that's bound to happen, like a spell of bad weather. Let's never forget that only in the absence of war, social development becomes a possibility. As a representative of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, we bring to this esteemed gathering our commitment to social justice and human rights, rooted in principles of solidarity and equality. Our diverse experiences underscore the importance of placing people's right and justice at the center. And I would like to close my remarks by recalling the words of a great social democrat and a great German chancellor, Willy Brandt, who knew from first hand the terrible consequences of global strife. Peace is not everything, but everything is nothing without peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Breuning, for your message, and FES for their sustained support of the Civil Society Forum throughout the years. Friedrich Ebert Foundation work is very important throughout the world, and we thank you for your continued commitment to improving the lives of our planet's most vulnerable people and ensuring that no one is left behind. We thank you again for your work here, and we continue to look forward to future collaborations. One last time, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for their presence, their support, and their interventions to the Civil Society Forum. You have been a wonderful group of people to work with, and we couldn't have done this without you. Now, logistically, the forum will be here in this room the entire day. The next session will begin just a few minutes after, shifting around the panel and bringing the next panel on. The focus will be on structural barriers and transformative policies to achieve social progress. And the session 1 will end at 11:30, and then you will have the opportunity to enjoy our lunch break, the lunch that is offered by the NGO CSocD outside the CR4 next to Vienna Cafe. And you are all invited to participate in the networking session, which will start at 12:15. And you will have the opportunity there to establish collaboration and to share insights and ideas. Then at 1:15, the session 2 will start, focusing on best practices that can serve as models to achieving true social justice. We are looking forward to a very productive day. Thank you for being with us, and I hope that you find the 2024 Civil Society Forum interesting, engaging, and most inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent moderations. I'll carry on now because the next panel is coming.
Yes.
Sure.
Hello, everybody. We're ready to begin the next panel. So if you can take your seat, that will be great.
Please, everybody, please take your seats. Thank you.
Excellencies, UN staff members, CSO colleagues, a warm welcome to all of you to thematic session 1, focusing on structural barriers and transformative policies to social progress. Thank you, Despina Aphrodite-Milakias, Chair of the Civil Society Forum, and Jean Quinn, Chair of the NGO Committee on Financing, for inviting me to moderate this session. My name is Anita Thomas. I chair the NGO Committee on Financing for Development in New York and represent Women First International Fund at the UN. I'll share a few initial remarks to set the tone of our discussion today. The 2024 Social Progress Index, encompassing 13 years of social progress data across 170 countries, reported that in total, 61 countries saw a significant decline in their social progress in 2023, and 77 more stagnated. Only 32 countries saw any real progress. In this scenario, where we are facing a social progress recession and confronted with the reality that only 1/3 of countries will have halved their national poverty levels by 2030, the role of transformative social policies grounded in human rights and supported by democratic decision-making and political will are crucial. For meaningful impact, such policies must also act in tandem with economic policies that promote redistribution of income and wealth, inclusive and equitable access to capacity, resources, and decent jobs, protection against life and market risk, strengthening households' resilience to adverse weather shocks, as well as leveraging fiscal policy to support poverty reduction. While the economic growth has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the last half-century, there is a clear need for shift in the way we design, develop, finance, and implement social policies when they continue to leave a certain segment of the society behind, failing to address their basic human needs, failing to invest in their education, skilling, upskilling, and advancing financial and digital inclusion to boost their capacity to earn a livelihood and improve their life. The experience of COVID-19 brought to light the far-reaching health and socioeconomic inequalities in many countries. But it also brought to light how when countries made the necessary investments, they ensured that social policies generated the intended benefit. For instance, countries that had invested in digital public infrastructure, supported by a conducive regulatory framework before the pandemic, were able to advance digital and financial inclusion of their citizens, ensuring cash transfers reached them on time, a lifeline for so many during the pandemic. This speaks to the importance of not just developing social policy measures that could promote transformational change, but also following an integrated approach to ensure the expected impact is achieved. Social policies must be designed and implemented in close partnership with civil society organizations who are on the ground and closest to the issue to address the structural barriers that prevent people from entering or remaining in the labor force or earning at their potential, reducing their purchasing power, which in turn translates to less money flowing into the economy, adversely impacting the government's ability to finance public goods. Without addressing these barriers, systemic challenges to participation that are correlated with non-productive attributes, including race, ethnicity, gender, age, and geography, among others, will continue to plague the system and have larger economic consequences. To cite an example from the US, according to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, if the racial gap in median household income in Missouri were closed, it could potentially add $8.5 billion annually to the disposable income of the state's economy. Speaking to the intersectional role of domestic and economic policies, the role of domestic resource mobilization to finance public goods such as social protection, health, and education through taxation, and by addressing leakage of funds through illicit financial flows, tax evasion, and tax avoidance is crucial. But in the current scenario, when countries, especially developing countries, are weighted down by the external debt burdens, where much of their revenues get directed toward paying off the principal and interest of their external debt, consequential austerity measures translate to defunding or underfunding public goods. From this angle, for transformative social policies to take root and make a meaningful impact, the global financial architecture must be able to meet the current needs of the world. The current global financial architecture, crafted in 1945 after the Second World War, designed by and for the industrialized countries of the post-war period, is not fit for purpose, as many of the current challenges, climate risk, and social inequalities, including gender inequality, were not under consideration when they were designed. To ensure the delivery of universal social and economic justice and transformation, there needs to be surety of stable and long-term financing at scale. This cannot happen without large-scale reforms. The recent agreement towards a global tax convention and strong calls for global financial architecture reforms by UN member states are very encouraging. As civil society, we should move in tandem through coordinated and advocacy efforts. I'll close with a quote from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. The time has come to replace the broken social contract and to create a new one geared to greater inclusion and sustainability. Thank you for listening to me. And with that, I would like to welcome our first speaker, His Excellency, Mr. Fergal Mythen, Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Ireland to the United Nations. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Anita. I think you said it all, to be honest. You got a lot into a very short introduction there. My name is Fergal Mythen. I'm the Irish Ambassador to the UN for the last 2 years. During that time, I've been heavily involved in the co-facilitation role for the Sustainable Development Goals. We had the midterm review last year. We worked a lot with Qatar and with other member states on really taking a really serious stock take of where the SDGs were, the hopes that we invested in them in 2015, how much we were falling short in terms of implementation and delivery. And really what we wanted to do last September for the summit was to bring world leaders back to the UN to recommit, to renew their vows to the Sustainable Development Goals, to say, let's recommit. We know some reasons why they went off track, and you mentioned COVID, we mentioned conflict, but I think even before 2019, 2020, they were heading off track. So we really wanted to focus the attention of the world's leaders on the need to get that vision, those goals back on track across the board. Interestingly, what we didn't do last year was do a step-by-step, line-by-line analysis of the SDGs. We really took a lens to say, where is it really falling short? And so much of our discussion was on the reform of the international financial architecture. So much of the attention was on the MDBs, their role, where they're failing, where they're delivering, where they're not delivering. Structural issues. Not so much on ODA volumes, but really getting at the structural dimension of the challenges in implementing the SDGs. And I think that's why the title of today's discussion is really important. Structural barriers, not piecemeal approach, not sticking plasters to solve problems, but really addressing the root causes of inequality, social divisions, and really tackling those and making a genuine change. And Anita, and I'm sure the other speakers will be able to speak to that in a much deeper way than I am. I'm not an expert in this field. For us as well, for Ireland, it's really important to have civil society in the room. That's a challenge in this day and age. We see the pushback on human rights, we see the pushback on gender rights, but we also see the real pushback on civil society, on the civil space. In 2014, 2015, we were reflecting with some NGOs who were in the room during the discussions and negotiations on the SDGs. They were, to quote Hamilton, they were in the room where it happens. You have been slowly pushed out of that room. And even last year during our consultations, we really struggled to ensure that we could keep the door open, even in some way, to have civil society inputting your voice, your experience, your analysis from direct experience. And we look at the current processes for Summit of the Future. We look at current processes looking towards the World Social Development Summit, and we can see that shrinking civil space. And certainly for Ireland, it's really important that you be in the room in a meaningful way, and that you be in the room when governments at the national level or at regional level are making decisions around social development. Diplomats, officials, government ministers, we don't have all the answers. We don't have the sole monopoly on expertise, and we need a direct lived experience and the direct inputs of groups and activists and practitioners who are bringing all of that experience into the room when we design policies at the national level. Policies not making policies for people in difficulty or who need inequality addressed, but making policies with people. And I think that's really important. And that's not just because it sounds nice and it's a kumbaya thing to say. It's about making policies that will really make a difference. It's about making policies that will really shift the dial and impact. So it's not just a nice thing to say. It actually it's really important if you want policies to stick and to be maintained. So your role is really important. This civil society forum is really important. It's a long week for you. I hope it's a meaningful week. I hope you're challenging us, the diplomats and the member states. I hope you're challenging each other. It's really important. We live through a difficult time, I think it's fair to say. It's a difficult time globally. We see what's happening inside Gaza. We see Ukraine. We see the Sahel. We see the Horn of Africa. We see Myanmar, Afghanistan, all the conflicts and how that impacts on the global world, on the economy. We saw that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact on food insecurity. We see the impact of that. But we also see the impact of conflict on social cohesion. And on the multilateral system that we've developed since the Second World War. Coming out of the Second World War, we all knew that we had to do things better. We saw the failure of the League of Nations. We saw the failure of of what went before the Second World War. We saw the cataclysm of the Second World War, not just in Europe, but across the globe. And, world leadership and activists, knew that we had to do something better, and hence the development of the multilateral system, hence the development of international human rights law, international humanitarian law, a system based on fairness and equality, not might is right. And for a small country like Ireland, that was hugely important, that we weren't going to be buffeted by great power politics, but we were going to build a new world based on equality and fairness and agreement and consensus. And we're seeing that being really shaken. We're seeing international humanitarian law not being respected in all cases. We're seeing human rights law being pushed back. We're seeing the civil society space closing down. And we're seeing, the difficulty in getting the multilateral system from the Security Council down to actually really operate and to do its job in terms of peace, stability, but also economic, social, cultural rights. And we see that with the challenges in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, in implementing agreements entered into, in implementing commitments given in terms of climate change, climate financing, etc. We see all that, and then we see the rising sense of despondency, particularly in the global south. We saw that through COVID, where so many people felt, well, actually, we weren't all in it together. There wasn't equal access to vaccines, there wasn't equal access to technology, there wasn't equal playing field, and we see that in so many areas. So the sense of hopelessness and despondency is there, and I think that's something we really have to push against. We really have to push against despondency, because hopelessness is not a policy. Hopelessness is defeat, and in many ways, it suits some. It suits some that people give up. It suits some that the world continues as it is in its unfairness and in its inequalities, and we can't allow that to happen. And to give up is to give in, and is to allow the multilateral system to fail, is to allow the international financial architecture to continue not delivering for people, and we have to guard against that and fight against that, and we have to really work hard to ensure we don't give in and give up. On so many issues we could speak at length here, and I really don't want to, because I think there's some really qualified people here to speak about the structural issues that I can't speak to in any meaningful sense. All I know is it's really important that we keep working together on human rights, women's rights, international humanitarian law, economic and social, cultural rights, that we see civil, political, economic and social, cultural rights as indivisible, as important, not trading off one for the other, not trading off the right to development vis-a-vis women's rights, not a trade-off, not division, not pitting brother against brother, sister against sister, but working together across all those headings. And that's why for Ireland it was really important we take part fully in this commission this week. We take part in 4 like this. Likewise, we'll be bringing that energy to the CSW week, just working across all the 4 that we have to just push against division, push against hatred, push it against despondency, and working well together. So I've lots of speaking points, but I'm not going to go into them. Just say we still believe in the Sustainable Development Goals, we still believe in the multilateral system, we still believe in the UN, we still believe in the civil space. It's worth fighting for, it's worth working for, and we will not give up. And we hope you'll emerge from this week with the same energy that you always bring to the UN. I love these weeks, I love this week, I love CSW, because we open the doors and the energy rushes into the rooms, the GA, etc. And it's really, really important that we keep that space open for all of you, where we can work together and listen and challenge, not always agree, but challenge and make this world a better place. Thank you.
Civil society organizations. Sorry, yeah, I should do this. And for your enthusiasm and energy to engage with civil society organizations, and for your leadership to renew the vows towards sustainable development. You also, and the efforts that you're calling for pushback on human rights violations and shrinking civil space, as well as for highlighting the importance of social cohesion and a system based on fairness and equality if we are serious about reaching a new world. We should work hard, just like you said, not to give up, because To give up is to give in. So thank you for your very strong and powerful words. Thank you. With that, I would like to invite Mr. Patrick Anderson, Chief Social Policy Analysis Section, Division of Inclusive Social Development, UNDESA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and let me start by thanking the NGO Committee on Social Development and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for inviting us and me to this panel. Over the next 5 minutes or so, I will focus my presentation on one specific transformative policy, namely social protection, and I will, within that time, I will also try to touch a little bit upon how we can broaden the coverage. Do I have a clip? Okay, there it is. Thank you. So we all know that social protection is vital to cushion households against external shocks and normal life events, such as having a child, getting sick, old, or unemployed. Adequate income security throughout the life cycle also promotes upward mobility and social progress. It reduces inequality, increases labor productivity, and supports behavioral shifts towards healthier lives, long-term planning, and accumulation of assets. Social protection is, however, first and foremost a human right and has been identified as an enabler for implementing the 2030 Agenda. Despite all the benefits social protection brings about and the need to better meet ongoing and emerging challenges, such as increasing inequality and poverty, population aging, digital transformation, disasters, and climate change, less than half of the global population is covered by at least one social protection scheme. This means that more than 5 billion people around the world are left completely uncovered to fight for themselves. When schemes do exist, the benefits are usually so low, so it doesn't really have a great impact. Now turning to the figure on screen, it shows go back please, thank you. So this shows some 150 countries across the world and how they fare in terms of social protection coverage, which is the y-axis, and the public spending on social protection, which is the x-axis. The red horizontal line sits at around 47%, and it shows the overall social protection coverage in the world. So all countries below this line have a lower coverage than the global average. Just to say that each dot is a country, and they're not named for different reasons, but not singling anyone out here. The green vertical line at 6.7% shows the unweighted country average of public spending on social protection as share of national GDP. Countries to the left of this line spends less than the average. In fact, half of the countries spends less than 5% of GDP on social protection, and 1/3 spends less than 2%. The 3 larger colored dots represent the average coverage and spending for Africa in red, Asia Pacific in purple, and then you have the orange one for Europe and Central Asia. So for Europe and Central Asia, just to position this, it reaches 84% in coverage and 17.5% of GDP in public spending. Depending on where countries are positioned in the figure, the focus of action should be different. Just to give an example, the lower left box, where you have Asia Pacific and Africa in, are both spending and coverage is low and need to increase. In the upper left box, coverage in the above is above the average, but spending remains low, an indication that benefits may be too low to be effective. In the lower right box, spending is higher, but limited coverage, which indicates that maybe it's just a smaller group of people that are being covered, like government employees, for example. So in short, more countries should move up to the upper right box to have a better coverage and a useful coverage of people. So the significant underinvestment in social protection, absence of schemes, the lack of overall social protection strategy, and the high labor market informality are the key reasons behind the social protection deficit. An inclusive and effective social protection system that is sustainable over time needs to be embedded in national legislation and development agendas. It needs to be based on a clear vision and shared understanding by all key stakeholders. It also needs to ensure coverage for all throughout life for key life contingencies. Benefit payments need to be adequate, regular, and predictable. To maintain trust in the system, entitlements, eligibility assessments need to be clear and easily understood. This requires capable institutions that are well governed and accountable. Finally, and importantly, additional financial resources need to be mobilized. I will therefore end my presentation with a couple of slides on this last point of resource mobilization and how to create fiscal space for social protection. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So one effective way to expand is to expand the tax base by enforcing compliance frameworks and using progressive scales for taxing incomes, wealth, and profit. A progressive tax system with clear redistributive aims underpinned by the principles of solidarity is also central for reducing wealth concentration and income inequalities. The figure shows the total tax revenue as share of GDP by country. It reveals that there is room to increase taxation in many countries. The total tax revenue vary by country from less than 3% to over 45% of national GDP. In fact, more than half of the country's tax revenues accounts for less than 20% of their GDP. Next slide, please. So, a different opportunity, or another approach to mobilize funding is to step up investment in people is a question of political priority. And President Turk just mentioned this in his kind of last words. And this is so where government should consider reprioritizing public spending. And the figure illustrates one such possibility, and it compares the national government expenditures on social protection and the share spent on defense or the armed forces. In almost a quarter of the countries above the red diagonal line, spending on the defense sector exceeds that of social protection. I thought it was just interesting that I had this chart that President Turk mentioned in his last words, that it's a priority. We always hear that from governments that there's not enough funds, so fiscal space is always very limited when it comes to social services and social policies. But it's in many cases it's a choice. It's a political choice to be made what to spend the money on. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, for really an insightful session, and also pointing out the importance of trust. You talked about, you highlighted the significant underinvestment in social protection measures, and that too many countries are left without social protection. And so the importance of creating a fiscal space for social protection through progressive taxation, and also highlighting the importance of political will to reprioritize how resources are channeled towards advancing social protection measures. So thank you for your insightful remarks. That I would like to welcome Barbara Adams, Senior Policy Analyst, Global Policy Forum. Over to you, Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. And actually, not only is it delightful to be here, it's actually delightful to be in this particular seat on this particular panel. I'm getting really strong energy from my neighbor. And Patrick Anderson has just identified much of what I would emphasize in terms of public resources and so on. So if he will allow me, I'd like to kind of carry on from there and just mention a couple of really crucial challenges and then make a couple of suggestions of priorities for our work going forward. I think the importance of public finance has already just been very clearly laid out. But I think what we really have to acknowledge is the way in which the public sector over the last decades, as a result of policies, not only domestic but also internationally, have completely undermined the public sector and have also somehow or other seemed to undermine and diminish the accountability of the public sector to the people, as we say in the 2030 agenda, to make sure we reach the furthest behind first. We emphasize a lot inclusion. I think we need to shift and talk about drivers exclusion when we develop our policies and strategies, policy demands going forward. There's so much emphasis on the quantity of resources, but it's the quality. And we really need to look at the misuse of public resources, which we're told are limited, and of course they're not. Military expenditure makes it extremely clear. And also, I would say, during COVID, in a number of countries, when it was understood that public resources were really, really necessary, some countries did it. The country we were in found a way of finding those resources, even though we were told repeatedly in these halls that the money is all now in the private sector. And we're also seeing that more and more of public resources are being used to incentivize the private sector as the provider of essential services, education, health, clean water, etc. We've also heard today, very encouragingly, a lot of comments about how this is a rights issue. And rights are not a market commodity. They cannot be provided subject to the ups and downs of supply and demand and the price system. So not only are we undermining public finances, we really have somehow or other undermined the actual accountability. And in so doing that for the public sector, we actually are not maintaining strong public institutions accountable to people. So also we've heard this morning, encouragingly, that we can't be naive about public finance, because public finance at the moment is favoring war and instruments of war over peace, sustainable development, and human rights. Additionally, this is not only a domestic issue. So often we talk about social development as a domestic issue, as if the distributive mechanism is purely distributive, and we don't pay attention to the cross-border, to the trade policies, to the investment regimes, to the debt crises that basically influence the fiscal space and the resources that are available at the domestic level as well. And so I think that these are all issues that belong squarely in challenges that we need to address, not just regularly here in the Commission on Social Development, but in some other fora, which I'll mention in a minute. Now, I was asked, and Anita knows me a little bit, if I had any thoughts on transformative policy recommendations that might be necessary. And I was thrilled a little bit earlier to hear her hint at what she knows is one of my favorite topics. We have to get beyond GDP. We have to get beyond the idea that this is the measure of progress, that GDP itself supports development. Frankly, I think it undermines it. GDP as a measure invisibilizes unpaid care economy. And I think we know very much what is happening and where the burden rests in terms of becoming the care economy and the health system. GDP basically undervalues the informal economy. And so many countries, developing countries, so much of their economy and employment and work are in the informal economy. GDP, when you think of what it is, it's aggregate. You just add up the economic numbers. So countries that have higher paid salaries, market performance, great big bonuses for bosses, etc., actually look like they are better managed economies because their GDP looks greater. And you look at the rankings. Frankly, to me, as a measure of development, not GDP for GDP, fine, but we use GDP over and over again to determine policies. We use 2 successive quarters of GDP to define whether we're in recession. That drives economic policies. We use GDP in all kinds of ways. Not only is GDP inadequate for what we're concerned about, it actually rewards the problems. If we cut down trees, if we create deserts for agribusiness, that contributes to the GDP. If we don't do that, if we support and work with communities that care about sustainable agriculture and they work respectfully with nature, somehow or other we don't count it. And it doesn't define and influence policy. One other thing, because I'm sure I'm going to run out of time, or I have already, GDP is not just a technical issue, the preserve of statisticians. To actually change this as the premier measure of how economies talk to each other is a political issue. This was actually recognized, I was sort of thrilled to hear it in the commission a few days ago by the Brazilian Minister Dias, when he said that the belief that economic growth alone would reduce disparities has been proven false. We have lots of interesting studies, but we don't have political movement. Now, this particular issue is hanging on by a thread in the 2030 agenda and is hanging on by another thread. I hope they're connected, and I hope they are getting thicker, in the preparations for the Summit of the Future. And I really think this is a really important opportunity to deal with this, hopefully not too much further into the future, critical and unknown issue. One other area I'd like to highlight as a transformative issue, we don't have in the multilateral system any process, any forum where there is accountability, where inequalities are what the debate, the policies, the direction are all about. And by inequalities, I don't just mean income inequalities. I mean non-income inequalities. I mean wealth inequalities. I mean inequalities within and between countries. And I would like to say, as we're edging towards perhaps a World Summit for Social Development in 2025, I'd like us all to be extremely ambitious and work to make sure that that summit gives us a serious council to tackle and hold accountable member states and ourselves to reducing all kinds of inequalities. Ta.
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, thank you, Barbara. We always learn so much from you at every session that we attend, and it's always something new. So thank you for your insights, your brilliance, and also bring forth the serious considerations of drivers of exclusion, importance of considering quality over quantity, and you also talked about the private sector resources and how public finance is being used to leverage private sector resources, leading into situations of de-risking. And these are all areas that we should pay close attention to if we are serious about financing social policies in an equitable and inclusive fashion. And you also touched upon the issue of going beyond GDP, a bigger conversation for us to have. And I'm hoping that as we prepare for the Financing for Development conference, which is scheduled for 2025, in collaboration with the Social Summit, we will be able to come together and really partner towards some synergic advocacy areas. So thank you for highlighting all these key challenges and how we can address them, how important it is to address them. With that, I would like to welcome Lydia Stazen, Executive Director of the Ruff Institute of Global Homelessness, DePaul University. Over to you, Lydia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the NGO Commission on Social Development, the organizers of the Civil Society Forum, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and my fellow panelists for having me here today. It's really a delight and honor to be with you to talk about global homelessness in 7 minutes. So I will be specifically speaking to homelessness. The Institute works with governments, NGOs, people with the lived experience of homelessness, academia, and other stakeholders on every inhabited continent. We've learned that sometimes policy can mean different things in different contexts, so my remarks today are targeted towards legislative policy, the system of laws and policies that are passed by global, national, regional, and municipal governments and that have a major influence on our collective work to address homelessness. So some of the current challenges, I've actually been rewriting my presentation over here a little bit to respond and react to some of my panelists, and listening to His Excellency from Ireland, I realized I made a major oversight on this slide, which is there is no SDG indicator on homelessness. And that has implications for social development ministries, for national government policies, and the closest that we get is an indicator on affordable housing, which is an important part of the equation to resolve homelessness, but doesn't go far enough because we know from partnering with people of lived experience, they need a particular type of housing and services to really support them back to stability. Gaps in definitions of homelessness are a problem globally. There's a lack of data collection on people experiencing homelessness. I'll touch on those two a little bit more in my presentation later. We also see that policy creates silos between government agencies. So, for example, the creation of housing stock and the management of housing subsidies and so on are nearly always managed by a department or ministry of housing, whereas homelessness has been historically considered the remit of ministries of social development. And so in some places, these ministries collaborate really well. In other places, they are very separate, and it's very difficult to get housing units set aside for people experiencing homelessness because they're just managed by different agencies. And that's just one example. The work on homelessness needs to extend to ministries that govern health, employment, education, migration, carceral systems, and so on. Homelessness is a deeply intersectional issue that touches many, many areas of a person's life, and so the legislation needs to support multi-agency collaborations. We also see that oftentimes policy and legislation are not connected to funding streams. So another example that I'll bring to you today, in my home state of Illinois here in the United States, the state legislature passed a law requiring every higher education institution to establish a house or a staff position to liaise with students who are homeless or housing insecure. But the state did not provide any funding for that position. And so DePaul University, where IGH is housed, had to incorporate that additional responsibility into a staff person's already very full plate. So the extent to which policy and legislation can be effectively implemented is often tied to the funding or the lack thereof. We also see a sort of one-size-fits-all approach in a lot of the homelessness legislation that we review. We are seeing a worrying upward trend in policies and legislation that criminalize homelessness, that make it illegal to be homeless, that allow governments to incarcerate people who are homeless. And we also see a lack of recognition of systemic drivers of homelessness. There's this understanding that or there's this belief, this incorrect belief that homelessness is an individual's failing, that they have made a bad choice or a series of bad choices that have led them to become homeless. But what we know from both the data and from partnering with people of lived experience is that homelessness is a failure of systems. As Mark McGreevy, one of the founders of IGH and a familiar name to many of you in this room, always says, if homelessness was a choice, why don't rich people choose it? So moving on to talk a little bit more about the definitions, we need to see policy and legislation align with common definitions. We often hear that there's no definition of homelessness. In fact, there are several common and widely used definitions of homelessness, and what we need is for those definitions to be aligned and enshrined in legislation. I point you towards two United Nations resolutions, the first from this Commission on Social Development in 2020, and the second from the General Assembly in 2021, as well as the Secretary General's recent report on homelessness from 2023. These resolutions and reports do a great job of kind of gathering together the common definitions into a comprehensive, global, and inclusive description of homelessness that we recommend be adopted at global, national, and local levels. And this description is in three parts: people living without accommodation, people living in temporary or crisis accommodation, and people living in inadequate and insecure housing. But just referring back to my original point about the silos between government agencies, my own country of the United States recognizes the first two forms of homelessness in our homeless legislation that our Department of Housing and Urban Development is tasked with implementing, and our Department of Education recognizes all three forms of homelessness in the policies that they implement. So even across our federal agencies here in the United States, there's not agreement on the definition. And why is definition of homelessness important? That's how we know the problem that we're trying to solve together. And right along the heels of that, we need to have better data collection around these categories of homelessness. And we need that measurement to be enshrined in the legislation and also funded. Data collection can be somewhat expensive. So we actually, this is an interactive map of the sort of publicly available global homeless data that our team has pulled together. You can find this on our website. You can hover over each country. You can see what their definition of homelessness is. If they have one, you can see their methodologies for collecting data and so on. We're currently working on the next iteration of this map that would layer in each country's homelessness legislation. And you can see there's many countries that are colored in gray. There's no information on homelessness in those countries. And so one of our aims at IGH is to work with governments and civil society to do a better job of defining, collecting data, and tying it to effective policies and programs. Because data isn't just data for information's sake. Data helps us to know whether policies and programs are being effective at preventing, reducing, and ending homelessness. Data helps us to make changes to do better, because behind every data point is a person who's experiencing the trauma of homelessness. This is their data, and we need to make sure that it is inclusive, community-owned data, and that we're using that data to do a better job. So where do we sort of go next towards transformative homelessness policy? This was my easiest slide to do because it's essentially the reverse of the challenges. So I would also, again, add in there, we need an SDG indicator on homelessness. In terms of transformation, we need policy that's co-produced by people with the lived experience of homelessness. We need policy that is driven by justice and equity and a human rights framing. I believe the human rights frame is going to become more and more important as we see huge waves of migration driven by climate events, by war and conflict, by poverty. And in order to adjust to these shocks that are only going to grow, we must embrace the transformative idea that housing isn't just for particular citizens of particular countries, but housing is for people because they are human. We need policy that drives multi-sectoral collaboration. We need policy that's tied to funding. We need policy that's tied to social protection floors. Housing and homelessness currently are not part of the typical social protection floor policies. We need universal prevention efforts to keep and prevent people from becoming homeless. We need policy and legislation that recognizes that particular people groups have particular needs, and we need to create programs that support those particular needs. And we need to recognize clearly that homelessness is a failure of systems and not a failure of individuals. It's IGH's pleasure to work with governments and civil society all around the world on their homeless policy. So if you'd like to connect with us for more information, we're easily accessible online. So thank you again for allowing me to be with you today and to share this quick overview of policies.
Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you, Lydia, especially for pointing out the need for an SDG indicator on homelessness, for defining what homelessness, the need for defining what homelessness actually means, and the importance of data collection. and for the work that you do for strengthening advocacy on the ground, collaborating with governments and civil society to move the needle. So thank you so much for your insightful remarks. With that, we will go to our online speaker, Mr. Haroon Bharat, Director, Development Policy Research Unit, School of Economics, University of Cape Town. Over to you, Mr. Bharat.
Through the chair that I'm audible. Yeah, okay, wonderful. I have a set of slides which are way too many for the 7 minutes I have. So through the chair, if you'll permit me to ask for the slides to be shown. I'm not sure if they're up yet. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. And again, it's a pleasure to be here at the invitation of the Civil Society Forum. Apologies I can't be with you in New York. The focus of my very brief input, and the slides can be provided to the audience afterwards, is on social protection in sub-Saharan Africa, really following up on Mr. Anderson, who spoke before me, in trying to perhaps provide a regional representation of how you think about social protection within the context of low-income countries. If I can get the next slide, I really have 5 key points I want to make, which I will elaborate on through the slides, but if I run out of time, I would have made them at the beginning. Really the background for the challenge of social protection in Africa lies within a broader, if you like, challenge of growth and jobs, and I'll talk through that through 2 slides. I want to then turn to whether there is underspending in social protection that is specific to sub-Saharan Africa or Africa as a whole, or is there a particular undervaluation or an undervaluing of social protection in Africa relative to other low-income regions? I then thirdly will talk a little bit about building the baseline, what I call building the traditional and new infrastructure that is required for social protection in Africa, which I think is often overlooked. Fourthly, we'll talk about what I call social pivots, social policy pivots, that you can get a foothold in spreading social protection if you reach the informal sector, for example, and I'll give two instances if there's time. Finally, I want to talk about financing. We often think it's about underfinancing, and I want to argue that it's not about the lack of finance, but it's the nature of funding that happens through the fiscus in Africa. If we can have the next slide. So the first point is that if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, a disproportionate share of the world's youth and working age population by 2100 will reside in sub-Saharan Africa. Very quickly, close to 50% of the world's youth will reside in Africa by 2100. 42 out of 100 working age population individuals will be in Africa. So in a different way, Chair, a disproportionate share of the world's employment challenge will lie in Africa. And I think that's really important in the context of social protection. The next slide, please. The problem is the growth trajectory, or what we call the patterns of structural transformation in sub-Saharan Africa, and I do take the point of the previous speaker that GDP is a very inadequate and poor indicator of living standards. If we hold on that thought for a while, the problem I have is in that last bullet. While Africa accounts for 14% of the world's labor force, it only accounts for 7.8 or 8% of the wage employed. So if you're thinking of contributory-based social protection systems, you are going to struggle in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. And yet, the AU agenda for 2063 for my own continent, I'm dialing in from South Africa, the Abidjan Declaration for 2019, all call for an increase in social protection spending in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at that data there, the global average on social protection is over 6 times higher than it is in sub-Saharan Africa. Even the closest region, the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, spends about 3 times more than sub-Saharan Africa, where the average is abysmally at about 2%. And so too little spending is well known, but let's go to the next slide, and what you find is something very, very interesting. is, and it's this last two bullets that are really important, there's a lot of data there, is that low-income countries as a whole spend 40% of the average of high-income countries on health, right, and other services actually, but they only spend 6% of what the average rich country spends on social protection. Now, this may be a stage of development, so you get to health and education first, and then you get to social protection, but it could just be a bias against, unintended bias against social protection. Next slide shows that the problem, though, is particularly acute in sub-Saharan Africa. So if we control for GDP level or income level of the country, you find that in sub-Saharan Africa, low-income countries and middle-income countries actually spend less on social protection than other non-African middle-income countries or low-income countries. So there's something going on that's specific to my continent. Next slide, please. In trying to, so that's my sort of second big point is around the spending patterns. But if you're trying to build social protection systems, you need what is called building the baseline. The most important components of building social protection in a society include a political figurehead and a champion, many of whom are in that room in New York, a dedicated ministry or agency that is going to roll out social protection, and qualified staff that are able to operate IT systems, look at registration and targeting, means testing. All of those three components, political figurehead, a ministry or agency, and qualified staff, are the baseline you require to build a social protection system. One example of how poor the baseline is in sub-Saharan Africa is that a study from the World Bank showed that from a sample of 17 economies in Africa, only two have an existing social register, and only 2 have a dedicated national population register. Those are critical elements. It's like trying to build a house without a foundation. If you don't have a national population register, you won't be able to build decent social protection. Next slide shows that you could bypass this through IT systems and mobile phones, through technology. Mobile phones allow for leaping in terms of registration, and there's some really good examples in the DRC and Togo where this has occurred. And I think that's a real way to get some big returns. If I could move to the next slide, which I will actually, Chair, very quickly skip over, but I had examples of I've run out of time, but 2 social pivots which I think are really important, where you can spread social protection to the informal sector first. And we had examples in Ghana and in South Africa, which is the next slide. But then if I look at financing of social protection, which will take me to the next slide, very, very important things. A lot of sub-Saharan African countries are actually dependent on donor funding for social protection programs. And we think this is a function of income levels and how poor sub-Saharan African countries are. And I want to posit something else may be going on. If we take the next slide, what's important to look at, right, is subsidies versus transfers. And what the data shows, right, is a far higher spending, right, as a proportion of GDP, right, amongst low-income countries and lower middle-income countries on subsidies rather than social protection. And so what we end up finding is there's a switch in the fiscus towards subsidies, right, oil subsidies and so on, rather than social protection. Why is this bad is the right panel. The right panel shows that subsidies are deeply regressive, right? Those are the green lines, right, rather than the red lines, which shows that social protection is very progressive. So in fact, the problem is not necessarily the quantum of spending, it's the redistribution of budgets away from subsidies towards social protection. The next slide shows how undervalued and social protection is in Africa. Irrespective of the category of the African economy that I've got there, right, whether they're in conflict or not, and so on, social protection or social safety net expenditure as a share of GDP remains the lowest for almost all categories of spending, including education, health, and worryingly military spending. So countries are undervaluing social protection in the African context. And so my second last slide, Chair, would suggest, right, that there are other ways apart from redistributing within the spending budget which is the taxation system. If you look at tax collection, we often don't think about this, but as a share of GDP, low-income countries and those in Africa are collecting far too little tax, right? So they're collecting 11% of GDP in taxes compared to 32% in OECD countries. So that's because you're correcting for GDP, it's a proportion, that's the problem. And so you start looking at things like property taxes, indirect health taxes, right, to cut out alcohol, tobacco, sugar, and carbon taxes, all of which can revitalize the fiscus with a target towards social protection. And so my final slide, Chair, is just a summary of the points I've made, which is if we're going to think about social protection in sub-Saharan Africa, we do need to realize there's a little bit of a penalty that sits in sub-Saharan Africa, and to pivot away, you need to build a baseline. You need to think about exploiting short-term opportunities such as the informal sector in order to pivot towards social protection, but also reduce donor dependence on social protection and think about the movement away from subsidies and also revitalizing the tax system to free up spending for social protection. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Barat. Thank you for that overview of and analysis of social protection policy spending and allocations in sub-Saharan Africa, and the importance of building a baseline that with proper investments in the infrastructure that underpins how the social protection policies are to be implemented, and also for pointing out the importance of inclusive, progressive tax policy measures. So with that, I would like to transition to an NGO video compilation of grassroots voices, and over to you. Thank you so much.
Anita, we have a technical issue. Anita, we have a technical issue with the video. In the meantime, can you please ask the audience if they have any questions until the video is ready?
Okay, perfect, no worries. Yeah, thank you so much to all my panelists. This has been an incredible, resourceful, insightful presentations, and I'm sure all of you have learned quite a bit from the session, and you have a lot of questions to share with us. So I'd like to ask you to raise. I'll call out for 3 questions, and please mention which panelist you would like to address this question to, and so we can move forward. Opening the floor for any questions. Go ahead, Ivan.
Hello, Ivan from Sikh Human Rights Group. The question is addressed to Mr. Anderson. Louder. Okay. So the question is addressed to Mr. Anderson. You spoke about public spending expenditures, but what we see from different countries and also different private foundations that are pushing for, in order to, for the public social protection, they, instead of pushing for public social protection, they are pushing for private tools as a social protection. What's the what are the main what does UNDESA or what is the main counter argument for pushing for public social expenditure instead of private solutions for the same matter?
Directed toward the Irish ambassador, because I found your presentation very interesting, but also grim in terms of the statement of where we are. And I was particularly interested in the idea of the pushback on space for civil society, and I've experienced that as well. But how can we push back against the pushback, as I think the Secretary General said about women's rights? But what are the avenues for doing something about this shrinking space?
Oh, sorry.
To do with subsidies. I think we heard how social protection could be, in fact, funded, but we hear how subsidies actually are robbing the system, if I could put it that way, and ensuring that social protection is not continued to be rolled out. And I am heartened in some senses to hear that the issue of military expenditure being surfaced. It has come up here year after year in some of our advocacy. But in this year, we've been reluctant because of the global situation. And so, akin to something that Lynn said, what processes can be used to enable people to listen to each other and to help bring about a change in mindsets? The subsidy to our speaker from South Africa, and then if anybody else wishes to address that along with Lynn's question. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And so over to Patrick on the first question.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you for the question. I'm a little bit, I don't know where to start. Sometimes you see that people talk about private social protection or family social protection as public social protection. In my mind, at least, social protection is only public, and it's a state obligation to provide social protection to people. I can't really see what the incentives would be for the private sector to come in and take on this responsibility. What would their incentive be to have an equal treatment of people, to have transparent systems in place, to make sure that benefits are handed out in a continuous way? I think for continuity, for long-term transparency, I do not think that such an important responsibility should be handed over to the private sector. I think, however, in certain instances, you could have private sector or certain agencies being part of the delivery of the schemes and the systems, but not in terms of the foundation of them. That would be, if that responds to your question. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be very brief because I know we're under time pressure. I would say pester power, being a pain, being a thorn in the side, not giving up, not going away. Organizations don't like pressure. They don't like hassle and annoyance. So you have to keep on pressurizing the UN system, member states, your countries, and keep on producing your analysis and documentation and keep on turning up and demanding a right of entry and a right to speak and a right to be heard. It's not always going to be successful, but if you go away, that'll make some people happy. So keep on, be a pain is my best analysis there. And I mean that in a very respectful way, obviously, but like nothing is given easily. Nothing is given power, voice, presence, access is never yielded easily. It has to be worked for and demanded, and so keep on doing what you're doing, I think, is the best way, but don't give up. Thank you.
And to Mr. Bharat on the question of subsidies. Is Mr. Bharat online? Okay.
On Africa and,
yes, please.
And other low-income countries, agriculture products and energy subsidies dominate the African landscape in the pursuit of protecting political power and to service local interest groups. And the entire subsidy machinery within the African context in many countries is designed to maintain political power, patronage, and so on. And the social protection system is a democratic form of redistribution, right? Because it's means-tested and it goes to the poor. And that's why it's far more progressive. And I think a little bit more pressure around, or at least just exposing the notion that there is a trade-off between subsidies versus income transfers is a really important start. Thanks.
Thank you. And so the last question that Winifred raised, it ties up well with our action item that we were talking about towards the end. So if maybe transition to the video and then come back to that question, Winifred. Despina, if I may suggest. Yeah, it's coming. Yeah.
Please bear with us just 2 more minutes. We still encounter some difficulties with the video, but we will be right with you in 2 minutes. Thank you. Thank you for understanding.
So the ambassador has to leave shortly, so he's just going to give us a few closing comments. Okay, thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really hate leaving a panel early, so I'm really sorry I have to step away for 11:30. But just thank you for being here. Thank you for hearing us, listening to us. I just want to thank the panelists for the really insightful analysis and in-depth analysis. And certainly we in our mission will take a lot of this away and keep on going. We'll probably see some of you again for CSW. But keep on knocking on these doors, keep on demanding a place at the table, and good luck with your work. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Sorry about that, everybody. There's still...
For example, there was supposed to be a school.
Is it working? Okay.
Since 2015, the condition of people has improved a bit, but not to the expectations of the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, there was supposed to be a school and a health facility within a radius of 5 kilometers, but that is not the case in the community I live in.
Fish farmers have lost their livelihood as their fishes were washed away by floods. It has also increased the risk of illness through increasing temperature. Climate change has affected the health and well-being through the impacts of extreme events, worsening changes in the spread of infectious diseases due to lack of clean drinking water, insufficient food, and lack of basic needs like secure shelter, clothes, etc., etc.
Those left behind are human beings who have the potential to live together on a peaceful, prosperous, and caring planet, capable of changing the unjust economic, political, educational, and health systems that impoverish them. Living in poverty prevents anyone from living with dignity.
The issue of racism remains largely unchallenged by the SDGs, in spite of the promise to leave no one behind. We welcome the government's recently published National Action Plan Against Racism. However, we are deeply concerned about the failure to provide funding for measures to address systemic change.
Les mères célibataires font face à la stigmatisation, la pauvreté, l'absence de soutien familial ou social, l'accès limité à l'éducation et à l'emploi.
Workers need safe factory, the workers need living wage, the workers need freedom of association and fundamental rights. Stop gender-based violence and sexual harassment. And the main problem in the global supply chain, people are treated as a cheap labor.
For my family's well-being, I need to have a stable source of income for our basic needs, especially food, and for our health and education of my children.
Young people in my community doesn't have access to the proper training or to the decent employment.
Are married very early and I are not free to do what they want. I need to work to support my family, but I wanted to dance. That's why I didn't have access to learn dance, but I didn't give up.
We have 1.2 billion young people in this world, and it has never been so important to be responsive, holistic, and intersectoral in our approaches to programs and policies.
I feel that they have to listen and hear the youth voice.
We deserve justice. We deserve justice. We deserve justice.
Inya kukmu do engineer binaria kantinya. Ing do aburen santhal sumaj ren kuri ko adhikar re hara buru lagi moy shiksha ar paisa teka godo jarura.
I wish to have our community with unity and with peaceful life, to keep our life simple and beautiful, to raise our children with good education and future.
We dream a world of true social justice.
My dream is a world which is safe for women and girls, and there is an end to all forms of gender-based violence.
We must advocate and ensure that we have more women, young women and girls sitting at the table. And this can be done through advocating for a quota system when it comes to decision-making positions in the country, so that we have effective and efficient policies that protect women and girls.
My hopes for 2030: realization that corporates, contributors, and those responsible for changing our climate be more accountable to the people in this world, old and young, the unvoiced and the unborn, the poor especially.
Saya adalah berkontribusi dalam mewujudkan masyarakat yang berdaya dan bermartabat.
My dream is to seek solutions where everybody wins. A win-win for all and for the common good will then have to be the working definition of both compassion and justice. No ignorance, no greed, no individualism, no apathy, no wars, no fighting. Only winners everywhere.
Who will speak so their voice will be heard?
you. Thank you for that beautiful video and for the NGO Committee on Social Development for putting it together, such a moving video that called about how we have to rise up to the challenge. We are serious about advancing an inclusive and equitable world for everyone. And with that, I would like to go to each of our speakers. Your call of action, listening to the video, the names of the people are not mentioned, so just speaking to the issues, if you can, and I think some of them are listening online, so it'll be very important for you to, speak to those issues as to who will you speak for and what will you do. That's your call for action. If you can, wrap up with a few comments on that. Go ahead with your.
Thank you. So I'd like to respond not to any one particular person that we heard from in that video, but really to the collective, and to be very clear that at the Institute of Global Homelessness, we do not speak for anyone, we speak with them, and all of our work is really designed to surface and support local community-led solutions and solutions that are proposed by people who have the lived experience of homelessness, which I do not personally have. And so wherever we can in our work around the world, we use our influence to pass the mic and to ensure that people with the lived experience of homelessness are at the tables where policies and legislation are being created. There's often a phrase that comes, I believe, from sort of the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us, and that is a principle that we very much take to heart at the Institute of Global Homelessness. There are incredible collectives around the world of people who have lived experience of homelessness, and we are deeply, deeply privileged to be able to work in deep partnership with them so that we do not, again, have to speak for anyone, but we speak with and we platform their voices in those seats of power.
Thank you. I think that also addressed the question that Winifred was talking about, what process can be enabled to listen to people. So you spoke to that very clearly. And so I'll go to Patrick. Please share your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I will be very short. I would direct the request to governments and to ask them to step up their political commitment towards universal health coverage, universal social protection, and affordable education. Because I think these are basic fundamental opportunities that have such an enormous impact on access. We see that access to, or malnutrition, or access to electricity, et cetera, right? Also, just one last comment on, because there's been so much on social protection today. Social protection is not only for the poor. It's not only to lift people out of poverty. It's for everyone, rich or poor or in the middle. But for those close to poverty, it's about making sure that people don't fall into poverty, or you don't need to become poor to receive your right to social protection or health care. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, and I'll go to Barbara.
Like Lydia, I really don't have the right to speak for others. I certainly work with groups and networks of people, frankly, primarily in small and medium countries, because their voices are heard less in the member state discussions. I think it's important to understand the power imbalances that not only affect our issues, but also actually affect the process of decision-making itself, so much of which I think is unfair. I focus right now energies on looking at the one or two keystones, linchpins that could open more space for people to pursue and advocate their rights. I think we are very privileged to be able to come into UN headquarters and have some of this engagement. And I think it's really important that the work that we do is to enable people themselves to engage with governments. I think it's really important that a lot of this work takes place at the national level, because in a way, as Patrick said, and maybe saying it a little bit further, it's also essential that the positions that come together in these rooms actually themselves have higher quality and are more related to people's rights. And I think that comes from more where people live than from here. When it comes here, we are debating what comes. It's very difficult to make the changes top down, frankly.
Thank you, Barbara, and I'll go to Harun online.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. Just a one-liner from me. I mean, social assistance or social protection is probably the most democratic form of empowering poor and marginalized communities. Cash in hand allows decisions to be concentrated in the household or the individual, and for me that is far more powerful than governments making decisions about what products to subsidize or not subsidize and so on, because as I've shown, that tends to lead to political economy decisions rather than decisions which benefit the poor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Harun. And so with that, I don't think I need to do a big closing remark because much has been said. We know what a call for action is. We need to work outside silos across our aisles to ensure that these actions that are being taken at the global level translates effectively to the ground for people and the planet. And so as Ambassador shared with us, we should work hard not to give up. To give up is to give in. So keep pushing back, and that's our mandate. So with that, I would like to close. Thank you, everybody.
So just a reminder, everybody, please, outside the catering is offered to you, so please enjoy yourself. Thank you.